Good morning. It's been almost 2 months since the election. Justin Trudeau called the election because of the urgency of the times, he said. He said it was a pivotal moment in Canada's history. So pivotal that he hasn't even met with his own MPs who were elected for almost 2 months, and he's delaying a return of the House of Commons. His first order of business is to let his new Liberal members of Parliament know that they will have to accept a radical Liberal-NDP coalition agreement. This coalition will mean billions of dollars of new spending to buy just Jagmeet Singh's silence. Les élections ont eu lieu il y a presque 2 mois. Après presque 2 mois, Justin Trudeau va finalement avoir une réunion avec ses propres députés. Son premier ordre du jour va être de dire à ses députés libéraux qu'ils vont devoir accepter un accord pour créer une coalition libérale néo-démocrate radicale. Cette coalition va provoquer des milliards de dollars en nouvelles dépenses, spécialement pour acheter le silence de Jagmeet Singh. Canadians can't afford this coalition. The Liberal-NDP coalition would be a disaster for the Canadian economy and cause devastating financial impacts for workers and communities from coast to coast to coast. Canadians are already struggling with rising prices, rising cost of living in Justin Trudeau's economy. Inflation is running at its highest point in 18 years. Paychecks have barely moved, and the economy is just limping along. The cost of everyday essentials, from gas to groceries to housing, are all going up. Household budgets are stretched thin, especially for seniors living on fixed income and families raising young children. This coalition will create billions in new spending that will further drive up inflation even more. And this coalition will mean that Jagmeet Singh will be able to push an even more radical agenda that will threaten the livelihoods of millions of Canadians. Les coûts de produits comme l'essence, l'épicerie et les logements augmentent de jour en jour. Tous les jours, les budgets des familles en resserrent un peu plus, surtout pour les personnes âgées qui vivent d'un revenu fixe et les familles avec des petits-enfants. Cette coalition va entraîner des milliards de dollars en nouvelles dépenses. Et ces dépenses vont faire grimper le taux d'inflation encore et encore. Cette coalition va permettre à Jagmeet Singh de réaliser des politiques radicales. Ces politiques vont menacer les moyens de subsistance des millions de Canadiens. A Liberal-NDP coalition would shut down Canadian energy and resource sectors, eliminating thousands of jobs, dividing the country, and making Canada a poorer and less relevant nation. Canada's energy sector is the cleanest, most ethical, and most environmentally conscious in the world. When Canadian oil and gas producers commit to reduce emissions or to partner with Indigenous communities or enterprises, they will deliver on those commitments. That is not the case anywhere else in the world. By turning its back on hardworking Canadians, the Liberal-NDP coalition will increase Canada's reliance on countries with horrific human rights records and records that are poor on the environment and other important issues. The NDP will also help cover up Mr. Trudeau's corruption and ensure that he will continue to freely break or ignore laws without consequence. They've already done this several times over the last 6 years. Conservatives from across Canada will not stand by while the Liberal-NDP coalition threatens our prosperity and unity as a country. We are the only voice that will fight tirelessly for Canadians. We are the only voice that will work to rebuild our economy and fight inflation. And we are the only party that will seek to unite Canadians rather than continue the politics of division. L'NPD va également aider Justin Trudeau à camoufler sa corruption en plus de l'aider à violer les lois fédérales, comme ils le font depuis 6 ans maintenant. Les conservateurs ne vont pas demeurer le bras croisé pendant que la coalition libérale-NPD menace la prospérité des travailleurs et des familles. Nous allons tout faire pour défendre les Canadiens. In the months leading up to the campaign, I repeatedly warned that Justin Trudeau and the NDP have the same high tax, high spending agenda. Last June, I said we were at a crossroads, and despite having 4 parties, Canadians only had 2 choices: the Liberal-NDP bloc coalition or the Conservatives. Justin Trudeau has demonstrated time after time that he will do anything to hold on to power. He shut down Parliament, stifled dissent and accountability. He held an election in the middle of a pandemic. And now he's pledging a coalition to hide from Canadians. He's putting his clinging to power before the economic well-being of families. The election was a crossroads, and Justin Trudeau took a radical left turn. Canadians deserve better. In fact, Jagmeet Singh should tell the truth to Canadians. He did not run in that election on forming a coalition. So what is he being promised for him to break with his pledge during the election? Canadians deserve to be told the truth, and they deserve a parliament that will tackle the severe economic challenges facing Canadians across the country. There's only one party fighting to make life more affordable for Canadian families. If you care about securing your economic future and the economic future of your children and grandchildren, there remains only one choice: Canada's Conservatives. Un seul parti se bat pour rendre la vie plus abordable. Si vous voulez protéger votre avenir économique, celui de vos enfants et celui de vos petits-enfants, vous n'avez qu'un seul choix: le Parti conservateur du Canada. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your question.
We'll take question. I'm told there will be 6 questions with follow-up in total. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions. On m'indique qu'on a le temps pour 6 questions avec suivi. Première question, microphone 1.
Either Mr. O'Toole, Travis Danraj, CBC National News. We reached out to your caucus to ask about vaccination status because we, reached out to the leader's office and we didn't get much information. 81 of your MPs said that they're vaccinated. 38 did not respond or did not disclose. Do you or does anybody in the leadership of the party know the actual number of Conservative MPs that remain unvaccinated ahead of Parliament?
Well, thanks for the question, Travis. As you know, my office has said something very clearly, that all the MPs returning to Parliament on November 22nd and all senators participating as well will be vaccinated. That's important, and Conservatives will continue to follow all rules with respect to health guidance, including the vaccination of members of Parliament and senators for participation in the debates in Parliament. Vaccines are critical, and it's critical for us to show that leadership.
Okay, so I take away from that you don't know the actual number of your MPs because there have been estimates of 12, a handful, 5, 6. Do you actually know how many of your members remain unvaccinated at this moment?
All of our MPs that participate in the House will be vaccinated. I don't get into talking about the personal health situation of any member of Parliament, senator, or any Canadian. What I've tried to do since the earliest days of this pandemic is to promote vaccines, to make sure we answer any questions that people have about them and not politicize the taking or having questions answered about vaccines. I will continue to take that same approach.
Micro 2.
Bonjour, Monsieur O'Toole. I'd strongly encourage you to stay longer because we have a long line of questions here. Mais alors pour mes questions en français, je voulais savoir le 22 novembre, donc si un député conservateur non vacciné se présente quand même à la porte et brise les règles, est-ce qu'il pourra quand même rester dans votre caucus?
Comme j'ai dit, tous nos députés, tous nos sénateurs vont être vaccinés. Point final.
Et s'il brise les règles, qu'est-ce qui va se passer à ce moment-là?
Comme j'ai dit, comme d'habitude, on va respecter toutes les mesures sanitaires. On a fait ça pendant la pandémie. On a fait ça pendant l'élection en pleine pandémie. Ce n'est pas le cas avec M. Trudeau. Et c'est très important pour nos députés et nos sénateurs de respecter les règles ici sur la colline. Et on va faire ça.
Micro 1.
Oui, bonjour, Laurence Martin de Radio-Canada. Est-ce que vous pensez, M. O'Toole, que le PDG d'Air Canada doit démissionner parce qu'il ne parle pas français?
Je suis déçu par le discours de M. Rousseau. C'est très important de respecter nos 2 langues nationales et j'espère qu'il va avoir une approche, un engagement fort sur le français parce que c'est très important de respecter nos deux langues nationales, incluant avec une entreprise très importante comme Air Canada.
Je comprends que vous ne pensez pas qu'il doit quitter, en fait, qu'il doit seulement améliorer son français. Ma deuxième question est sur le mini-caucus des députés qui va avoir lieu ce soir sur la question de la vaccination. Est-ce que vous pensez que c'est une bonne idée que plusieurs de vos députés se regroupent ce soir pour parler de vaccination?
Il y a une grande différence entre le travail pour les députés, pour leurs concitoyens, et de créer la confusion sur l'efficacité des vaccins. Et il y a une différence. Et j'ai beaucoup de respect pour notre équipe et on doit travailler ensemble pour le bien-être des Canadiens. Les vaccins sont importants et c'est possible d'avoir un engagement pour vos citoyens, mais on doit laisser les commentaires sur les vaccins pour nos médecins. C'est très important de respecter les règles sanitaires et d'avoir une approche de leadership sur la santé des Canadiens. It's important to show leadership and respect for the health and well-being of Canadians, and there's a big difference between advocating for your constituents that may need accommodation in their workforce or are worried about losing their jobs, and confusing people with respect to public discussion about vaccines. And what I've said repeatedly for many, many months, we should be answering questions about people that have some degree of vaccine hesitancy. We should not be creating new questions.
Hi, Mr. O'Toole. Stephanie Taylor with the Canadian Press. I want to echo my colleague's earlier statement. It would be great if you could stay longer than the planned amount that you're going to stay for to take questions. But in
Is that your first question?
No, it's not. In talking about is there not a risk, though, if you have a mini caucus that is going to be advocating against vaccine mandates, that there will be discussion in that group where there could be anti-science sentiments, there could be messages that run contrary to public health messaging. Just yesterday, it seems that Ms. Gladue was calling into question the severity of COVID-19 versus polio. So why are you allowing your MPs to form this caucus when there seems to be a risk it could create added confusion to your message of go get vaccinated?
Well, as I just said, it's important for members of Parliament to advocate for their constituents who may be losing a job or may need reasonable accommodation. We do that all the time on a range of issues. But it's very different to cause confusion with respect to the health and well-being of Canadians. Ms. Gladue's interview did that yesterday, and it's not appropriate at a time we should be answering questions about vaccine hesitancy, not creating new questions. So our team will deal with this as a team because we respect one another and we have these discussions in caucus. But let me be crystal clear. The Conservative Party encourages people to get vaccinated, and all of our MPs, when we return to Parliament, will be respecting the rules here on the Hill. On doit avoir une approche plus professionnelle sur les conversations sur l'efficacité et la sécurité des vaccins. Ce n'était pas le cas hier avec Mme Gladue. Et on va parler comme une équipe sur ça. Parce que, comme j'ai dit, Laurence, il y a une grande différence entre votre travail comme un député pour vos concitoyens et les questions sur les accommodations raisonnables et des questions sur l'efficacité des vaccins. Les vaccins sont sécuritaires et efficaces et j'encourage tous les Canadiens à se faire vacciner. J'ai dit ça plusieurs de fois parce que c'est une question importante en pleine pandémie.
What do you also then make of comments made by Leslyn Lewis, who has also called into question the efficacy of vaccinating young children? Dean Allison as well has hosted broadcasts featuring scientists that kind of compare what's better, natural immunity to vaccinations. Are you going to be speaking to these MPs as well? What do you make of the messages they also are sending?
As I've said, there's a big difference between advocating for your constituents who may need reasonable accommodation and creating confusion about public health measures. It's a great example of why members of Parliament of all stripes should let the professionals, let the public health officials, let the physicians answer questions about efficacy of vaccines or provincial programs on vaccination. One thing we've seen in the pandemic from public officials, from people across the country, is social media is becoming the creation of instant experts across the country. I don't think that helps in our public discourse. I've tried consistently for a year not to politicize questions about vaccines, to try and find ways to answer questions and reduce hesitancy. We will continue to do that. And some of the instances, like Ms. Gladou's interview yesterday, add to more questions, and I don't think it's helpful.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. Mr. O'Toole, you just said that comments by Ms. Gladou and Ms. Lewis create confusion and so hesitancy. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to take any action against them? Are they still welcome to stay in your caucus? Are you going to talk to them, or are you going to kick them out?
Well, as you know, Glenn, we have conversations as a caucus, as we had before the return of Parliament, to confirm that all of our MPs and senators that participate on the 22nd and come here to do their job on behalf of Canadians will be vaccinated. We will continue, as we have, to support all public health measures and to encourage Canadians to learn more if they have any hesitation. Our team will address instances where people are causing more questions and perhaps adding to hesitancy, as opposed to advocating for their constituents and concerns about the border and other things. That's what we have to focus on as a team, and our team will address that as we do in accordance with the Reform Act.
Question about the border. The PCR test requirement for Canadians returning home remains in place. It's an impediment, especially for families who are traveling to the United States, coming back. Would you support rescinding that requirement, and would you want it scrapped completely or replaced with a PCR or with a antigen test? What would you do?
That's a great question, Glenn, because we're talking about the importance of vaccines. We're talking about the importance to get double vaccinated. Once people are double vaccinated, and we can eliminate threats with respect to the spread of a fourth wave or variants, we should make border moves easier. We should recognize how border communities are seeing their economies fall apart. And I do think our MPs and our caucus are engaged with some border mayors on both sides to see if we can eliminate some of these additional measures that are leading to delays and less travel, less tourism at a time our economy needs it. But that can be done once people are double vaccinated and risk can be mitigated. So it's an important question that our party has been pushing for a few weeks. C'est une question importante parce que avec les vaccinations des Canadiens, des Américains, c'est possible d'avoir une approche plus fluide à la frontière, particulièrement pour nos économies et le secteur touristique. Et on va continuer de poser des questions sur ça parce qu'avec les vaccinations et le niveau de vaccination, c'est possible d'utiliser les autres mesures et pas le test PCR tout le temps à la frontière.
Indique que c'est la dernière question. I'm told this is the last question. Stephanie?
Stephanie Levitz, the Toronto Star. Just going back to the subject of Ms. Gladue and other members of your caucus, you said our team will deal with this as a team because we respect one another, and obviously you also have the Reform Act provisions. Will you ask your caucus to kick people out if they are offside with public health messaging on vaccines?
Well, thanks, Stephanie. As you said, we respect people. It's why our team has already met twice. It's why we voted on the Reform Act to allow our caucus to have a lot of freedom with respect to decisions related to both the leader, my accountability, and to membership. Mr. Trudeau's team hasn't been meeting over the last 2 months, and we'll see if they allow that same degree of respect for their members with their vote on the Reform Act. Our team will talk about how we need to focus on the economy, on inflation, and as I said, reducing hesitancy and talking about how we can help families and advocate without creating more confusion. And those conversations, as you know, will be confidential. That's what a team does, but they're important because some of these conversations, like Ms. Gladou's comments yesterday, add to more uncertainty at a time that public officials should be reducing uncertainty.
Just as my follow-up, in French you said that all of your MPs and senators will be vaccinated when the House of Commons returns. In English you said all of your MPs who participate in the House of Commons when it returns. So I'm just going to ask you to please specify, will all of your members of Parliament, all of your caucus, be present and in the House on November 22nd?
Well, thanks for highlighting my French is not as perfect as my English. I am trying, and my answers are not identical. As I've said consistently since this issue came up, when our MPs and senators participate here on the Hill in debates, everyone will be vaccinated. As I've said throughout this crisis, it's important for our party and it's important for elected officials to demonstrate leadership. That means respecting all laws. That means reducing uncertainty about vaccines. It's why my wife and I filmed our vaccination process to try and answer questions about this. Public officials should be encouraging a positive dialogue, not dividing people, but certainly also not causing more potential hesitancy when I think we should work together. That will be our approach.
This concludes the press conference.
My name is Althea.
I'll take a few more at the mic.
There's only
Perfect.
two of us in line. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Althea Raj, the Toronto Star. Are you still opposed to vaccine mandates?
As you know, I think vaccines are critical, and I encourage as many people to get vaccinated as possible. In fact, what I suggested with respect to the federal government approach for federal employees, Mr. Trudeau has misled people about, including transportation. If you look and see what's happening in terms of some accommodations, you're seeing that happening in the Federal Civil Service exactly as how I predicted. But Mr. Trudeau, including today, will continue to mislead people and divide rather than try and say, let's get hesitancy down as much as possible. And we're going to be proposing some ideas on that. And let's, where we can, have some reasonable accommodations and not confuse people or divide people. So I support as many people as possible getting vaccinated and answering any questions that people that have some degree of hesitancy may have.
Thank you. As a follow-up, kind of a different tack, you started the press conference talking about the potential coalition agreement with the NDP. I'm wondering if in your conversation with the Prime Minister now several weeks ago, if you offered to work with him on any files, and if so, what those files would be, and if you didn't, can you explain to us why?
Yes, I did. In fact, I said we should continue to work together on reconciliation. It's very important to all Canadians, including myself. It's also why I thanked him for making the decision to go to Kamloops after his poor decision to take a holiday on the first day of Truth and Reconciliation. I thanked him for doing that. It's important to show leadership. It's important to work together. What I will say about that conversation is Mr. Trudeau wants a virtual parliament. He wants a coalition to never be accountable to anyone. This is why, despite this being a pivotal election in Canadian history, he's ignoring Parliament. We're not back for months. He's hoping to just spend a little more and get the NDP to not ask the tough questions. Conservatives will ask the tough questions. We will also hold him to account for his continued ethical and lapses in judgment. And that's why we're going to show up on Parliament, and we want to see real accountability, real committees, a real approach to accountability and transparency for the first time in 2 years. Dans ma conversation avec M. Trudeau, on a parlé sur la réconciliation et c'est important de travailler ensemble sur les appels d'action et sur le sujet de la réconciliation. C'est très important pour moi et pour notre caucus. M. Trudeau, il préfère un parlement virtuel parce qu'il n'y a pas un niveau de scrutiny pour lui avec ça. Et c'est pourquoi on a besoin d'un parlement normal, les comités normaux, et on doit arrêter les camouflages et la prorogation et les mesures qu'il a utilisées pour éviter les questions et l'accès pour les Canadiens.
Next question.
Ian Bailey, Globe and Mail. I wonder if you get a fuller answer on your thoughts about Ms. Gladoux's project. Do you support this? If so, why? And what should she be doing and she and her team be doing, in your view, to make this worthwhile if they're going to be going out and sort of looking into these matters?
Well, Ian, a fuller answer. I've said there's a big difference between MPs advocating for their constituents and looking for questions on people's economy or well-being and being impacted, whether it's from border measures, whether it's from the pandemic or what have you. MPs should do that, and Conservatives have a strong track record of being great advocates for people in their constituency. But there's a difference between creating more uncertainty about vaccines or adding to hesitancy at a time as public officials. We should be reducing hesitancy, answering questions, and we should try and not divide Canadians on the subject of vaccines. We saw Mr. Trudeau do that by announcing a mandate just before he called an election, hoping to divide people on that subject. And so I think Conservatives, we have an obligation to show as elected officials leadership. And that's what our caucus will be talking about. So I hope that's a fuller answer for you. But I want our MPs to come here and advocate for their constituents. And there's a lot of uncertainty out there. There's a lot of division in our country right now. Mr. Trudeau's cabinet appointments of Mr. Guilbeault and others at a time when the country's already fractured. Canada's a great country, but it's fragile, and it needs the Conservatives to be professional and to be here for the well-being of all Canadians.
And could you elaborate on what you found objectionable about Ms. Gladoux's comments yesterday?
Well, as I said, it is best for public officials to refer people to our public health authorities and our public health officers who've been doing long and hard work throughout this pandemic to answer questions about the pandemic, about vaccines, about all the tools that we have. And so for MPs to create confusion, that's a step backwards. And we saw that yesterday. So we will talk about that as a team because, as I said, we want MPs that come here and advocate for their constituents. But as public officials, we have a responsibility to not have debates like we see on social media and other places, to answer questions and have serious, respectful and professional debates for the well-being of all Canadians.
On m'indique que c'est la dernière question. I'm told this is the last question.
Mr. O'Toole, last month Canada was one of the countries that reached an OECD-led agreement on a two-pillar global tax deal, including redistributing some taxing rights and a global minimum rate. During the recent election, your platform said you oppose a global minimum rate. Do you support Canada's participation in the OECD-led deal that was reached last month?
Well, what I would like to see Canada is be a serious voice on the world stage again. And there is not a respect for trade rules, human rights norms, and emission reductions. So I don't want to see us start outsourcing all the measures we have to remain competitive as a country at a time that we see countries like India and China asking for decades longer periods of time to lower their emissions and meet international targets, while we're seeing investment leave Canada and go there. Mr. Trudeau, who doesn't seem to care about our economic competitiveness and is willing to say things to look good on the international stage, we need to make sure that we have the tools to draw talent, to draw jobs and investment to Canada. And one of those measures is our tax rate, but also making sure that we see carbon border adjustment tariffs for countries that do not take emission reduction seriously. We propose that in our campaign as well. We want to see human rights and the sourcing of materials away from countries that have terrible human rights records. We want to see that part of our economic dialogue. So this is why it's important for us to return as quickly as possible. We've got a supply chain shortage. We've got economic uncertainty in a lot of industries, including the hundreds of thousands of jobs in Western Canada in energy. We are seeing more Buy American, and we don't see any country asking for Canada to participate in any discussions. Mr. Trudeau's failing Canadians, and we're going to raise that when we return.
Respectfully, Mr. O'Toole, that had nothing to do with taxation. But I'll move on to the other part of it.
Because as I said, one of the measures is our corporate tax rate. So what we have to make sure is when we are working with other countries on emission reduction targets, on trade rules, on levels of taxation, we cannot allow other countries to game all these discussions while the Boy Scout Canada follows all the rules and actually sees our investment and job climate being hollowed out. We see the bad energy players benefiting while good players here in Canada see their competitiveness erode. So they're directly related.
So the finance minister has said that the government intends to move forward with legislation finalizing the enactment of Canada's own digital services tax by the end of the year. Given that you proposed a near identical DST in the campaign that just passed, will the Conservative Party vote in favor of that legislation when it's tabled?
Well, we'll have to see the legislation, but the fundamental element of fairness between the American web giants and Canadian players and Canadian content creators, both in French and English, we see as a big public policy goal, and we want to work there. Our concern has been also this government's attempt to erode liberty on social media, to change the way we regulate the internet. We saw that with C10. We will oppose those measures, as have most of the former commissioners of the CRTC, I might add. But we do want to see a fairer approach to taxation. We want to see Canadian content celebrated and set on an level playing field. Merci beaucoup.
Pouvez-vous prendre une autre question en français? Vous avez juste pris Merci, c'est bien gentil. Je veux juste revenir sur Mme Gladue, Mme Lewis. Je comprends que vous voulez laisser le soin au caucus de se prononcer, mais vous, personnellement, pensez-vous qu'elles peuvent rester membres de votre équipe? Vous êtes ici à nous dire qu'il faut défendre la vaccination, qu'il ne faut pas créer de confusion chez les gens qui ont une hésitation à se faire vacciner. Est-ce que vous ne manquez pas de leadership de ne pas nous dire, vous, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Les voulez-vous encore dans votre équipe?
Comme j'ai dit, j'aimerais voir un engagement fort sur les conversations positives sur l'efficacité et la sécurité des vaccins. Les vaccins sont très importants et c'est notre utile très important dans notre lutte contre la COVID-19. C'est pourquoi, comme leaders, tous nos députés doivent avoir une approche de respect pour les conversations sur la santé des Canadiens. Et j'étais déçu par la situation avec Mme Gladue hier et on va parler sur ça comme une équipe.
Vous ne répondez pas vraiment à la question, vous, ce que vous en pensez. Il y a des gens qui disent que vous manquez de leadership, de permettre ce mini-caucus-là dans votre parti. Vous n'avez pas l'air de vraiment montrer la poigne dure. Donc, vous, qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Puis ma question de suivi sur le Parlement hybride. Êtes-vous entièrement opposé à ce que le Parlement revienne siéger en personne? On est tous là en personne aujourd'hui. Il y a des événements en personne qui reprennent. Et si oui, est-ce que c'est pas simplement pour permettre à vos quelques députés de pouvoir siéger sans être vaccinés de façon hybride?
Premièrement, je vais répéter ma position sur notre caucus. Il y a une grande différence entre le rôle comme un député pour vos citoyens et votre responsabilité pour la santé et les questions sur la pandémie. Il y a une différence sur ça. Et je vais parler avec notre équipe sur ça. Mais pour le Parlement hybride, j'aimerais voir plus de transparence. Et les Canadiens méritent un gouvernement ouvert et les débats normaux dans la Chambre. Et c'est pourquoi on va pousser pour un Parlement normal, pas virtuellement, mais probablement c'était une chose dans les discussions, les négociations entre Mr. Singh et M. Trudeau pour leur coalition. Mais les Canadiens méritent mieux. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
This show has